The Mexican Revolution was an armed conflict that officially began on November 20th, 1910, against the government of General Porfirio Díaz, who had 7 consecutive presidential terms as head of the nation. This period was known as the Porfiriato, whose power did not come from the trust of the voters, but from the force and injustices. During this period, Mexico industrialized, railroads emerged, and our country was booming. It was said that our country began adopting French ideologies. Unfortunately, the reality was different because the Díaz government gave the expropriated lands of the indigenous people to the Americans, Spanish, French, and Germans, increasingly impoverishing the Mexican people and creating a discontent society. This discontent led to a civil war to fight for a true revolution, time for a real change. Regardless of what groups had as their flags, they united for one goal, which included political, social, and economic rights for all. Then they led a guerrilla war throughout one of the most convulsive times for Mexico, which left more than 1 million dead. However, despite being a bloody struggle for power, it also had positive results. The Constitution of 1917 was one of them. The victory against Villa and Zapata allowed Carranza to assume the presidency and call a Congress in Querétaro, with the purpose of drafting a new constitution for the country. In it, the principles embodied in the 1857 Constitution were reconsidered, consecrating 2 other revolutionary causes, such as agrarian law, labor rights, education, and health guaranteed by the state, freedom of the press, and political rights, which are still in force to this day. Background of the Mexican Revolution. These are linked to the capitalist exploitation and social injustices, which are mentioned in the following. Economics. It was a capitalist government that gave privileges to the classes that had the most, so that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Farmers were stripped of their lands by the same government, leaving these in the hands of foreigners, which caused the decline of agriculture, because owners were disconnected from their lands. Everything was left in the hands of the brutal and incompetent foreigners who whipped the peasants, so the situation became increasingly difficult. Social cause. There was great social inequality. Workers and farmers occupied the lowest place in the population, while businessmen, clergy, and politicians had more privilege in society. Political causes. Díaz was a dictator who took power in 1876, which lasted more than 30 years. He was re-elected 7 times due to fraud in the elections. The most humble population of Mexico was unhappy with their government because of the crisis they were experiencing. For this reason, the people organized themselves in search of an agrarian reform that would give them back their lands. With these ideas, they rose up against the government. In summary, we can say that the Mexican Revolution was a great armed movement that began on November 20th, 1910, with a rebellion led by Francisco I. Madero with the Plan of San Luis against Porfirio Díaz. It was the first of the great revolutions of the 20th century. During the Mexican Revolution, there were revolutionary groups from different political backgrounds. They organized under the shadow of leaders such as Emiliano Zapata, Francisco Villa, Venustiano Carranza, and Alvaro Bregon, and each of them prepared a document in which they expressed their demands. Emiliano Zapata had the Ayala Plan, in which he demanded the distribution of land to indigenous people and farmers, as well as the distribution of land, mountains, and waters to those who needed them. The Zapatista movement expressed the demands of the Mexican farmers who had been displaced by the Porfirista farmers and landowners, by which laborers and other rural workers in the center and south of the country joined this movement. Francisco Villa. In the north of the country, the Villista movement represented the desires and needs of the farm workers who demanded the distribution of lands used for agricultural and cattle ranches. Francisco Villa drew up the General Agrarian Law, which emphasized the reduction of large territorial properties to fair limits, equitably distributing surplus lands. Venustiano Carranza. Venustiano Carranza was governor of Coahuila during the Madero government, and upon his death he became the main revolutionary leader. His Plan of Guadalupe, in which he ignored the Huerta government, considered it necessary to reform the Constitution of 1857 to promote society, commerce, and industry in the most equitable way and favor education. Alvaro Bregon. Alvaro Bregon supported Carranza and joined the Constitutional Army since he agreed with him on the idea of making Mexico a modern country. When Victoriano Huerta usurped the presidency, Villistas and Zapatistas joined Venustiano Carranza to fight him. Given this, in August 1914, Huerta left the country and Carranza, who had been recognized as chief by other leaders, entered Mexico City in triumph. When Carranza occupied the presidency, the revolutionaries clashed, as many, including Zapata and Villa, did not agree, because they thought that they did not identify with the interests of the people. The revolutionary leaders met in Aguascalientes and appointed Eulalio Gutiérrez as president. Thus, the revolutionaries were divided into two camps. On one side, the Carrancistas, and on the other side, Villistas and Zapatistas. On the Carrancista side, General Alvaro Bregon led the Constitutionalist Army with great success. Under his command, Carranza's troops achieved decisive victories over their adversaries in 1915. Women in the Revolution. On all sides, they played a very important role as a support force for the revolutionaries. We recognize one of those who had frontline armed participation as Margarita Neri, who started her own army with 200 soldiers, later growing into 1,000 soldiers. These women soldiers commanded by her were known as the Adelitas.